thanks everyone for coming to my talk today. We're going to be talking about Salesforce and all the different vulnerabilities that you can find when you go and look in all the nooks and crannies in the application. So thanks everyone for coming today. Let's get started. A little who am I? My name's Jessa. I'm a penetration tester at a healthcare company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been in this position for about 3 years, but prior to that, I was in school. I studied computer science and environment and natural resources, and then I think at some point my senior year, I realized I was better at breaking code than actually coding. So I kind of shifted to the security space after that. I'm a badge life enthusiast, so if you see me at DEF CON, I usually have all the big electronic badges. Love it, really into that. In my free time, I'm a yoga instructor and runner, and I'm also a dog parent, so I didn't want to mention having a dog and not including a picture of him. So this is my dog, Atlas. He's a 3-year-old Cavapoo. He's not a security professional, but he is my best friend, and that says a lot for me. So let's get started. And if you like my talk, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. The agenda today, we're going to just talk about a little bit about the background. What exactly is Salesforce, and how does it differ from other applications? It's a big tool, so specifically I'll be talking about flow builder, page layout, widgets and chatter, and digital experience sites. Going into some of the security concerns and misconfigurations, specifically around improper access to objects and elevated user privileges, the attacks in Salesforce that you can do, and what exactly insecurities they reveal. And then kind of closing it off with remediation, detection, and prevention techniques that you can use in your own Salesforce environment or penetration tests, and then closing with a QA and future work. But sometimes easy means riskier security, and you're going to kind of see that later on. Wanting to start off with an advisory of 2 things. So I am not a Salesforce engineer. I'm a penetration tester. So a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today kind of come from that red team perspective and not the usual dev perspective. Another thing is, I don't know who here has used Salesforce before. Cool. So you probably know it's super complicated and complex. So this talk, since I really only have 30 minutes, is going to be a really high-level overview just for you to get started if you're interested in pen testing Salesforce applications. So with that being said, I'm not a Salesforce engineer, but I do know how to hack these applications. So kind of what is Salesforce? The TLDR, companies tend to have tons of customer data. And Salesforce, like other CRM tools, kind of help those support teams manage that data. So you can kind of think about some applications for Salesforce is you can create flows that allow customers to submit cases to your support team. You can use it for marketing or e-commerce websites, customer service portals, and community pages for customers to share and ask questions. This talk today is going to focus on 4 different features. So that's going to be Flow Builder, which kind of modifies these Salesforce objects, page layouts, which determine visibility, chatter widgets, which display the different information that you might want to see, and then digital experience sites that kind of wrap it all together and render these widgets. So just kind of what you can guess, what are the main issues here compared to the usual web app? Can anyone take a wild guess? B? All right, well, the answer's in the meme. So default configurations are very common within Salesforce applications. Usually when you're testing a web app, you'll kind of think of the OWASP top 10, cross-site scripting, CSRF attacks. But in this case, it's really all about misconfigurations. In this case, Salesforce has something called objects, and these represent business data. So you can think of customer contacts, site users, groups, case records, and they're often very lax by default. And you'll kind of see a little bit later how that occurs. And when you start to use Salesforce features, you'll begin to enable different things that might leak this data to your customers or other people in the environment. And it's not really super obvious. So there's tons of cool, unique things you can do, but if you don't really know what you're doing, security issues come up. And another interesting thing I kind of want to call out here is Salesforce is starting to migrate to this kind of approach called point-and-click programming. So in the past, a customer support team might have hired out a third-party developer to build out these Salesforce applications, but now someone can go in and just kind of drag and drop what they want to do, which makes things super easy. But again, if you're a non-technical person or someone without a security background, a lot of issues can come up. So we're going to kind of see that next. This is a flow builder. So when you look to the left, you'll see that's kind of like the back end of how you can build these processes. And basically what Flow Builder is, it's a feature within Salesforce that lets you automate really common tasks. So for example, you want a customer to be able to update their contact information. A Flow Builder will be a really great way to do that. Kind of the main security issues here is they work directly with those Salesforce objects. So you are modifying, editing, and viewing data when you create these flows. But yeah, to the left here, you'll see this is kind of how it looks. And this is just a very simple flow. But as you see that point and click, drag and drop programming, you don't really have to code anything. It's very easy. And then to the right, that's just kind of how it would look in the UI to the user. I think another thing I want to touch on that's a little bit confusing in Salesforce is oftentimes I think in the security space, we think of user permissions or user roles as user permissions. But in Salesforce, those actually aren't security related at all. That just shows the business purpose. So in Salesforce, when you're dealing with different user permissions and roles and all of that, those are actually called profiles. And when I learned that, it was just kind of confusing. So I kind of want to just say it because it's a fun security fact, I guess. But here, you can kind of start to think about what are the potential security issues. Well, now you have these non-technical support teams creating automated processes that change and manipulate data. And you can kind of ask yourself, how do privileges and user rights come into play when you start modifying these different objects and their records within them? The next feature I want to talk about is page layouts. And basically what page layouts are is they kind of determine the visibility for these Salesforce objects. In these Salesforce objects, they come with records. That's basically just the information about the said object. But what page layouts kind of do is they determine what record information users can see, edit, delete, or create. If you're a Salesforce customer, you can adjust page layouts to add and remove user interface elements. And you'll kind of see how this gets configured on the back end here, and leading into our first vulnerability or common finding that I oftentimes see. So in Salesforce, there's something called Salesforce Classic, which is the older version, and then Salesforce Lightning, which is the newer version. Both exist within an environment, and you can configure both. I think oftentimes a customer support team will say, well, I'm only dealing with Lightning. I don't really have to worry about the configurations in Salesforce Classic. I'm just going to ignore that. And you'll see the issue that comes up. So in this case, the top toggle for Salesforce Classic has more features enabled that a user could see. And then below it, the Lightning Experience Actions, which is the more modern version, has a lot less that you can see. And in the next screenshot, you'll kind of see what you can do. So this is a Salesforce Lightning UI application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a payload into the URL that will break it into that classic version that has more features enabled. So you can see I kind of added that payload, and now I'm broken into Salesforce Classic. And what's a feature that you see that wasn't in the previous slide? Well, now there's a recycle bin. So it's oh, what can I see here with this feature? And you click it, and now you can see any data that might have not been visible before, which is kind of interesting, I think. And again, a lot of the screenshots you'll see, it's from a test environment I created. And any data or PII that you see, it's also all fake data. So no one's information is actually being leaked here. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are chatter and widgets. So in Salesforce, chatter is a commonly used feature that allows users and their customers to connect, engage, and collaborate across the organization in real time. Kind of think of it as something like Slack or Teams, basically just a way to talk. And I want to note, it is enabled by default for Salesforce customers. So keeping that in mind, some common use cases for chatter are posting status updates, using Feed to post industry-relevant articles, and then also sending and receiving files. A really interesting thing about the file sending is Salesforce actually doesn't do any checking. So you could upload an executable and send it to someone, and it's not going to stop you, which is just very interesting and another medium finding I come across. But specifically, what I want to talk about is the log call, which is a commonly used widget, and basically it's a button that creates a completed task or activity record for objects, and it basically allows users to view and document various communications that they have with their customers and with one another. So with chatter enabled, and if an object is misconfigured, what kind of information do you think could accidentally be made available? And I'll kind of show that here. Again, this is a test environment. I'm logged in as just a public internet user. But since these contact objects have a misconfiguration where anyone on the internet basically can view them, now I can go in and type, say, John, and all the Johns in that Salesforce environment are coming up along with their account name, number, and address, and you can kind of see the issue here. So that kind of gets into that broken access control finding that I see a lot. Now, finally, I want to talk about digital experience sites. So digital experience sites, you can kind of think about it as this ribbon that ties all these other features together for customers to see and experience some data in your Salesforce environment. Once digital experience is enabled, it allows external users to access some of your company's data. Big red flag if you don't know what you're doing. And again, setting up a digital experience site can be done purely through point-and-click measures, so these customer support teams can go and build whatever they want. So now, thinking about what could go wrong here in the next slides. So I created a fake digital experience site, and since these account objects are able to be viewable to anyone, and I made this digital experience site public to the internet, I can actually go in, and now I see all this cool random information. For example, this account object, I can see names, who's in charge, emails, all of that, and that's really weird. I did kind of want to touch on how this happened and how I configured it to be insecure in this way, just so people can kind of understand what goes on in the back end. So the top screenshot here is that's making this digital experience site public to the internet. So in Salesforce, guest users, you can kind of just think about them as any random internet user. They don't need credentials. And what I'm doing here is I'm just enabling my site to be public. The second thing I do is I'm making those account objects readable in the bottom screenshot in the profiles. And then finally, I do really think Salesforce does do a good job at making it difficult for customer data to be completely public. But again, since this was a test environment, I didn't have all the different user roles and all that. So this is just something I had to do. But I created an additional role that basically made those account names viewable to guest users or public internet users. Now, another interesting thing about Salesforce is the different objects are assigned a ID. I know it looks random, but it actually isn't. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out how it all works, but if someone here knows how the IDs are assigned, I would be very interested, because that would make something like enumerating the URL very easy, or much easier. But yeah, in this case, you kind of know you're dealing with a Salesforce application when you look at the URL and you see a screen. When you see an ID kind of looking like this, you're like, okay, yeah, this is probably Salesforce. And these object records ID are oftentimes exposed by default. So kind of keeping that in mind, what can you do with that? And I'll show you right here. So I'm using something called Burp Suite. Burp Suite is just a very common attack proxy where you can capture requests and then modify them and then send them back. So what I did is I captured that URL GET request to that specific object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to Burp Intruder, which is basically just a feature within Burp Suite that lets you send a bunch of requests very quickly, very easily to enumerate and do fuzzing and all of that. So that's what I'm going to do. And I do want to say, Salesforce doesn't implement, or in the tests I've seen, Salesforce doesn't implement rate limiting. So you can basically fuzz this request as many times as you want, and it's not going to lock you out. So brute force, it's pretty easy. And this is just an example of that. I think I sent over 20,000 requests, and it didn't stop me. So Yeah, but when you're doing this enumeration, you can kind of know when you find a valid or valid object, when you can kind of just look at the results. So all the invalid IDs, they have a length of like a little over 2,000, but a valid one has a length of like a much bigger length. And from doing this, I found another object, contact object that was viewable. So in this case, it was Josh Ortiz, and you can kind of see in the URL that was the ID I found. But now I'm able to like enumerate and find all this additional information just by knowing that in the URL, objects are exposed with their ID. And those are kind of a lot of my big security findings that I find in Salesforce tests. And now I kind of want to wrap it up with some remediation, prevention, and detection techniques. So for remediation, definitely make sure that you're locking down your objects, implementing the idea of least privilege. Inspect all your user roles with the knowledge that they can oftentimes be insecure by default. Be very aware of what you enable, so understanding that if you create something like a digital experience site, you may be enabling it to the public internet, which is very scary. Detection, it's pretty hard to detect these vulnerabilities because Salesforce doesn't really offer, to my knowledge, anything that will show like, hey, you're making these objects very viewable, you might want to check in on that. So I would say test your Salesforce applications. I feel like there's this very common misconception that if you're using a commonly used tool like Salesforce or whatever, it's automatically secure. But that's not true. Like as you see, like you can still configure it in a way that's insecure or that leaks data. So keeping that in your mind, and as a security person, making sure that you're communicating with your Salesforce support teams at your company so they do know this, because it's kind of one of those things that goes unnoticed unless someone says so. And then also just evaluate your different object permissions and pages. Like with the page layout, like I had the classic that had more features toggled than the lightning. So just being very aware that there's a lot of nooks and crannies that can go wrong. And then remediation, not much for now, but you'll kind of see in my future work what I hope to do about that. So in my future work, I'd love to kind of figure out what kind of default configuration shows up in flows, since that is automating a lot of processes and dealing with objects and other data. Digital experience site shenanigans, I would love to find a way to find these sites that were accidentally made public by companies and seeing what kind of data I can grab there. And then kind of asking myself, can we automate finding these security misconfigurations? So like creating a tool that you can run in your environment that kind of helps find these misconfigurations for you, since I don't really know if there's a public tool available yet. So kind of closing out, a lot of this seems like common sense, but again, I see these findings quite frequently when I'm doing real-world tests. So kind of seeing this as like a cautionary tale, that this seems obvious, but it still happens. So with that being said, I'll kind of move on to the Q&A portion, right? Or